Disclaimer. I'm not an expert, nor am I a nuclear physicist, engineer, or foreign policy expert. None of the information contained in the following is classified. All of the information is available open source. Welcome to another video. Before I begin, I must advise that despite all of the following, I am not endorsing, defending, or voicing any support for the Ayatollah of Iran or any support for the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is intended to be informative and provide context into why I oppose any new wars and any further undeclared hostilities on behalf of any nation or on any pretextual fabrication for war. I do not believe war with Iran is in the best interest of the United States. I do not support any action against a foreign power that poses no threat to the sovereign United States, and I do not support the U.S. getting involved with any conflict being fought by a foreign power that does not pose a legitimate and real threat to the United States. I oppose any new wars, regime changes, or intervention on behalf of a foreign nation. So let's get into this. Despite the constant lies and rhetoric issued by the government of Israel, Iran hasn't politically decided to pursue a nuclear weapons program. Iran is also part of the NPT. The NPT, or Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or shortened to Non-Proliferation Treaty, was drafted and adopted between 18 nations in 1968 and entered into force in 1970, the same year that Iran entered the deal while still under the leadership of the Shah. Although Iran has run afoul several times with the Safeguards Agreement, it has maintained that it is still a signee and within the limits of the treaty. Iran has cooperated with the IAEA regulations and inspections. The IAEA, or International Atomic Energy Agency, is a UN watchdog under the promotion of nuclear energy and works to inhibit nuclear weapons. 180 member states are signed on as being subject to IAEA regulations. Exceptions include North Korea, which withdrew in 1994, South Sudan, Suriname, Andorra, Equatorial Guinea, Micronesia, and a few others, 14 in total. Iran is also still abiding by the JCPOA. What is the JCPOA? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a 2015 plan signed by Iran with China, France, Russia, UK, Germany, and the US under President Barack Obama, colloquially dubbed the Iranian nuclear deal. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the plan. The JCPOA stipulated the limitation of uranium-235 enrichment to 20% for medical isotope use and 3.67% as the threshold needed for nuclear energy fuel. It capped the number of centrifuges to just over 6,000 and capped the stockpile of low-enriched uranium to 300 kilograms. It also called for the elimination of stockpiles of medium-enriched uranium above 21% and instituted more stringent inspections by the IAEA, which previously existed under the NPT. The JCPOA was designed to extend the breakout period for Iran to prepare enough material for a single nuclear weapon from 3 months to 1 year. The JCPOA also allowed for the relaxation of sanctions so Iran wasn't as economically restrained. With the U.S. withdrawal from the deal, there were reimposed sanctions. In May 2019, Iran announced it would suspend implementations of parts of the deal due to the failure of the United States to abide by the terms of the agreement, especially with regard to sanctions. In July 2019, they announced they would be enriching beyond the 3.67% limit, and in January 2020, Iran declared they would no longer abide by the deal's limitations, but would continue to cooperate with the IAEA. Latent nuclear deterrent. The figure 60% has been thrown around a lot lately. While 90% uranium enrichment is needed for a weapon, 60% also holds no medical or peaceful energy purposes. Despite enriching to 60%, Iran still cooperates with the IAEA, until 2023 when more sanctions were imposed following the start of the Gaza war, which Iran denies any involvement. In 2024, the IAEA visited Iran and they allowed inspectors to resume investigating the Iranian nuclear production. IAEA inspectors found no evidence that Iran was building a nuclear bomb. U.S. and EU intelligence, as of early 2025, have had no conclusive or actionable intelligence to suggest Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program, and the Iranian government has not made the political decision to pursue nuclear weapons. So why? Simply, latent nuclear deterrent. 60% uranium enrichment reduces the breakout period for Iran if they decide to produce a nuclear weapon. It gives them the strategic leverage. One direction, they can begin advanced enrichment to obtain weapons-grade uranium if under threat or actual attack, and does not break the threshold of weapons grade below 90%, and therefore makes them not in violation of international treaties. It can also be used as a negotiation tool to say we'll get rid of our highly enriched uranium in exchange for concessions or reductions of sanctions or normalization of relations, etc. Notably, both Japan and Germany have also mastered the enrichment process and have a latent nuclear deterrence in place. Japan specifically has stockpiles of plutonium in advanced enrichment facilities, but more on plutonium in a moment. Bottom line, Iran maintains a stockpile and capacity for highly enriched uranium as a means of deterrence, not aggression. Before we continue, we have to discuss the difference in nuclear weapons. In 1945, the United States became the first nuclear-armed nation in the world, detonating an implosion-type plutonium fission bomb. With atomic weapons, there are two kinds of bombs: implosion-type plutonium and gun-type uranium. An implosion type, like the one tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945, and what was detonated over Nagasaki, dubbed Fat Man, involves using conventional explosives to compress a plutonium core, forcing it to achieve critical mass and release massive amounts of energy all at once. Plutonium-239 is not naturally occurring, and therefore has to be produced in a reactor using uranium-238 and a process of chemical separation. Of note, Iran lacks the capability to produce plutonium-239. A gun-type device utilizes conventional explosives to fire a uranium bullet at a uranium target. Most commonly, a uranium ring is fired so that it slides over a uranium rod to achieve criticality. The enrichment of this uranium of 238 to 235 needs to be at a minimum of 85% enrichment, basically meaning uranium-238 is converted primarily through a centrifuge to lose 3 electrons and become U-235, a more volatile and unstable element. Theoretically, 20% enriched uranium could be used to make a nuclear weapon, but the amount needed is highly impractical. It's a scalable type of equation for the amount of uranium to make this type of device. A gun-type device was that which was detonated over the city of Hiroshima, dubbed Little Boy. The major difference between an implosion and gun-type device is scalability. A gun-type device requires a certain amount of U-235 to be viable as a nuclear weapon, whereas an implosion type can be miniaturized, although in doing so it would affect the overall yield. In terms of bombs, there are two forms of criticality with nuclear weapons: fission and fusion. Fission, also referred to as an atomic bomb, is a runaway nuclear chain reaction resulting from the nucleus of an atom splitting and producing a chain reaction that leads to the splitting of other atoms and so on. Fusion, however, is where instead of splitting an atom, the chain reaction is initiated by fusing 2 or more hydrogen atoms to create a nuclear release of energy, also known as hydrogen bombs. A hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear weapon, involves detonating an implosion device next to a fusion tamper that initiates the fusion process and creates a massive release of energy. Far more powerful than the fission weapons like what were dropped on Japan to end World War II. Hydrogen bombs are scalable and able to be fitted into a wide array of weapons platforms, similar to the plutonium implosion devices discussed earlier. The most common H-bomb platform is a warhead, typically used on intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, either launched from ground or sea-based platforms, cruise missiles, or in rare cases, nuclear-tipped torpedoes that can be fired from either a ship, submarine, or aircraft. But what about Iran? Iran lacks the capability to convert uranium-235 into plutonium-239. Plutonium production is far more complicated and difficult than simply converting naturally mined U-238 into U-235. Furthermore, the technology to build a fusion bomb is far more complex than simply using a gun-type bomb to achieve criticality, requiring not only plutonium for both stages of the bomb, but also other elements like tritium for boosting the implosion device and lithium-6 deuteride as a fusion fuel, which requires its own enrichment process that involves separating of lithium-6 from natural lithium. Iran has discovered lithium deposits and reserves within their country, but they're not currently at the stage of full-scale production and mining. So what does Iran have the potential capability to produce in terms of nuclear weapons? Basically, a U-235 gun-type bomb. One that cannot be fitted into a missile due to the size and weight limitations. For reference, Little Boy weighed 9,700 pounds, or 4,400 kilograms, and was 10 feet or 3 meters in length. For further reference, the typical thermonuclear warhead affixed to a Minuteman missile, the most common type that the U.S. employs, with a 300 to 475 kiloton yield, is about 3.5 feet in length. The only feasible delivery method for an Iranian nuclear weapon is from an aircraft-delivered bomb, similar to that of Fat Man, which Iran currently lacks in its Air Force inventory, and due to U.S., NATO, and Israeli military presence and monitoring capability in the region, would be impossible to deploy beyond its borders. Iran also lacks ballistic missile technology, even if they were somehow to have a missile capable of delivering the nuclear weapon that they currently, in theory, can manufacture, that is capable of coming anywhere close to the sovereign United States. Bottom line, they don't have the range with their missiles to reach the U.S. So, scalability is an issue, where Iran can't make a device due to not only technical limitations they possess, but also physics limitations of the type of device they're capable of producing. A gun-type fissile device would need to be, at a minimum, 60 kilograms of U-235. Little Boy was approximately 64 kilograms. And due to the size constraints, the necessity of a conventional explosive to launch the uranium bullet in order to go critical would have to be at least 2 feet in length without the casing. That doesn't include the external systems added to the casing, such as a trigger mechanism, air stabilization device, and safety mechanism, which is what contributed to Little Boy being an overall 10 feet in length. Furthermore, the gun-type uranium bomb is a highly inefficient bomb, especially considering the fact that the technology is 80 years old. At its current state, Iran is somewhere, technologically, equivalent to where the United States was in about 1942 or 1943. They have yet to develop any kind of concept of a device as of yet, and they're at least a year away if they began the enrichment process to go from 60 to 90%, which is not a fast process. Then, even if they had achieved 90% enrichment, they would still need to develop a weapon capable of achieving criticality and potentially test it, which would take time and use up the enriched uranium that they had, necessitating enrichment of more uranium, making for an even longer time frame. Breakdown in negotiations. Iran had been involved in talks, and where the talks tended to stall at the conclusion of the arbitrary end of the 60 days that Donald Trump set, was the stalemate on the Trump administration ultimatum. No uranium enrichment whatsoever. This was a point of contention for the Iranians, but they had an indication of continuing to attempt to negotiate with further talks scheduled for the weekend, which were interrupted by the Israeli attack on Iran. Iran had stated before that they wished to continue to abide by the JCPOA and have enrichment capabilities in order to sustain their nuclear energy capability. This would allow Iran to produce nuclear power so that they could maintain an export market for their oil, increasing their economic standing in the wake of continued international sanctions. Previously, Iranian oil export sanctions had been relaxed and was a major proponent to dissuade weapons exports to Yemen and anti-Israeli forces, lending to the idea that if oil export sanctions increased, Iran would have no economic incentive to not export weapons. Following the Israeli attack and subsequent B-2 bombing of Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities by the U.S., it's impossible to tell if these talks would have yielded any positive results, and we may never know as the future is still yet to be seen. So in closing, Iran has yet to make the political decision to pursue nuclear weapons. U.S. intelligence has indicated they do not currently have a nuclear weapons program. The IAEA has confirmed that they currently are not pursuing a nuclear weapons program, and even if they were, they lack the capability to build a modern device or platform capable of projecting a nuclear weapons capability beyond their territorial boundaries. The bomb would be too large to fit in a missile. It would be far too big for a sale to a non-state actor like a terrorist organization, and they would have no way of successfully deploying it. So what is the so-called nuclear threat that Iran poses? Essentially not much. The rhetoric is just talk intended on justification for more conflict and aggression. This is not to say that Iran's regime is the good guys in any sense, just that the nuclear threat that they pose is widely overblown and exaggerated. The continued aggressive stance, regardless of Iran's previous statements, is indicative of little interest in pursuing a peaceful diplomatic resolution with regard to the current Iranian regime. Even if Iran has chanted death to Israel and death to America, the statements on the other side, with Israel requesting permission to eliminate the Ayatollah and his government, wishing to enact regime change, and calling for Iran to be destroyed, as well as several U.S. military and civilian leaders calling for the destruction of Iran, is far from absolving either side of harmful rhetoric. If one wants to know why Iran says these things, I go into detail in a previous video, linked above and in the description. But that's all I have for today. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have anything to say, feel free to drop a comment. I make an effort to read all comments. Until next time.